This video is a tutorial on wiring harness connection for a 2-speeds electric drive axle assembly. Here are all the parts needed for the axle assembly. The first one is the power 3-phase lines U, V, W. This is an integrated wiring harness. This is the transmission controller. This is the motor controller. This is the positive and negative power line. This is the motor assembly, transmission, and shift actuator. The first step is to install the motor controller power line. Remove the motor controller cover. It is strictly prohibited to apply high voltage to the motor controller power line before installation. Then the power line is threaded into the motor controller through the gran head and tightened with bolts. The gran head does not need to be unscrewed under normal circumstances, but it is only removed here for convenience of demonstration. During the installation process, one-to-one installation is carried out according to the power line identification inside the motor controller. Now is the display after tightening it in turn. The power lines U, V, W correspond to the U, V, W marked inside the motor controller respectively. The positive and negative electrodes correspond to the positive and negative electrodes at the wire bundle end respectively. Then close the cover. Lock all bolts tightly. The second step is to install the motor power line. Power line extended from motor controller. Insert the U, V, W 3-phase wires into the corresponding holes of the motor respectively. The gland head of the motor does not need to be disassembled during installation. Here is an easy demonstration. Show what it looks like after assembly. Replace the cover plate. After installing the U, V, W 3-phase wires, you need to carefully check whether they are installed correctly. Follow the identification on each accessory to ensure that accessory connections match. Determine the rear locking cover bolt. Step 3. Connect the integrated wiring harness. Insert the connector with the motor controller end into the mating interface on the motor controller. Then plug the connector with the attached motor label into the mating interface on the motor assembly. Then, insert the connector with the identification for connecting the shift motor into the mating interface on the actuator. After that, insert the connector with input and output shaft identification into the mating interface on the transmission. Finally, start connecting the transmission controller. Insert the connector with the connection TCU identification into the mating interface on the TCU. TCU needs to pay attention to the corresponding identification label before connecting. This is a power system that can only be used for 96 volts and 15,000 watts. There's also a label on the back. It's the TCU number. Must correspond to the axle number. Mixing is strictly prohibited. This is the axle number. Locate the wiring harness connector with the gear position sensor label. Insert it into the plug-in interface of the shift actuator. Remember to push the lock on the connector all the way. This is the wiring harness connector with the debugging interface label, which is plugged into the debugging interface. This is the wiring harness connector with the instrument label, which is plugged into the instrument interface. This is a wiring harness connector with an accelerator label, which is inserted opposite to the accelerator and brake interfaces. This is the connector for plugging in the 12-volt low current power supply. 12-volt power supply is prohibited during wiring harness connection. This is the connector with the motor controller cooling fan label. Plug it into the corresponding interface on the motor controller. At this point, the connection of the 2-speeds electric drive axle wiring harness assembly has been completed. The gland head on the motor controller does not need to be removed. The gland head on the motor does not need to be removed.